All right. I have Talar with me. Did I get your first name right, Talar?
Yes, you did.
I
It's
did. Oh,
Talar.
amazing.
Well,
Oh, thank
Talar.
God. I was a little bit nervous.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So she's the VP of marketing over at Phonexa, and you and I were just chatting earlier that D, as nice as he is, was kind of the, I guess, pseudo connection between all this. And I've known D through LinkedIn osmosis, I guess, like we were talking about for a while. So it's good to finally meet and be chatting here.
Awesome. Same. Really looking forward to talking through some opportunities and some of the things that I've been observing and that you guys have been observing as you work with your client base as well.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that was kind of interesting too, when I was looking at LinkedIn, I noticed that you actually founded your own agency, it looks like, or your own company. Maybe you still do some GTM type work yourself, but it sounds like this is all kind of very related and some of the things we're going to be talking about at Phonexa specifically. But it sounds like you've been doing this for a while in terms of helping teams navigate GTM motions and how they're going to approach it, messaging, positioning, all that. What's the story there out of curiosity before we get into it?
Yeah, so I spent quite a bit of my career actually agency side, and then you know started really getting involved in Web3 and NFTs over the
Yeah.
last few years. So I helped lead marketing at two Web3 startups, which of course over the last few years um, there was a lot of nascency around sort of the technology itself and sort of the value
Hmm.
NFTs were bringing to their communities. So um, it was sort of building out the marketing functions and in many cases helping define some of the base definitions the industry could even really rely on when
Hmm.
working with brands and creators who were launching NFTs or collections for the first time. In that
Right.
process, with the volatility and sort of the Web3 space, there came an opportunity to really start a consulting practice, helping sort of startups in their earlier stages.
Hmm.
Web3 and SaaS really help really consult them through both their GTM planning as well as overall their demand generation programs.
Love it. Love it. I mean, and I think it's so prominent, especially at that stage, to need that type of help because there's so many things that need to be, foundationally set up from a product marketing perspective to make sure that all the activities you do below that are all aligned and make sense versus just throwing tons of stuff at the wall. But so
100%.
you were telling me, 1.5 months in the job, so you're just getting into it with Phonexa. You
Yes.
guys just did your first product marketing hire after 2 years of the company, right? I think you were saying as well.
Yes, we actually have the job post up now. So
Oh, do
we
you?
are
Oh, cool.
looking
Oh,
for an
perfect.
awesome product marketing manager in the LA area to join our team
Sweet.
and help us shape our shape our positioning and messaging across our products.
I love that. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people on the market right now, so I'm sure some that are listening. And I know even a great guy that you might talk to as well, who's a product marketing pro, who I'm sure knows a bunch of folks too. Robert Kaminsky, if you know
Okay.
him, he was actually on the show a couple weeks ago.
Oh no, but
So I'll have to make a quick intro. He's a really good guy. He's in Austin, Texas, I believe.
oh, that would be awesome. I'd love
So
to get an intro.
yeah, yeah. Well, cool. Well, so I saw a LinkedIn post that you had. I think it was a couple weeks ago or something like that, or maybe it was more recent, but you said something, and I think I'm quoting you correctly by saying every marketing problem started with a product marketing problem. And so when I read that, I was like, oh, wow, we could go in a lot of different directions with this. And I just thought it'd be fun, especially given that you're so new into Phonexa that I imagine all of this is literally like coming at you right now, where you're trying to put together a lot of these fundamental pieces to ultimately then decide, okay, what distribution channels, what specific campaigns and content, all that stuff do I need to layer to ultimately wrap up to a central theme. So I'd love it if like maybe you unpack that a little bit, like what you meant by that when you said that in that post. Maybe there's some stuff there that I didn't really get.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I was actually thinking about this because I did my MBA at my MBA at Pepperdine, and
Hmm.
so you go through my ride of courses, and my marketing professor at the time said every business problem starts with a marketing problem,
Hmm.
and so I was like, oh, that's really true in a lot of ways, or feels really true in a lot of ways. And then in my new role, as I kind of stepped into it, a lot of and across really sort of consulting across businesses, a lot of times, we're really focused on growth and scale and being able to do
Hmm.
that quickly. But in my new role and really across a lot of early stage startups that I've worked with, the next step of that statement sort of became true, which is every marketing problem is a product marketing problem. And I think
Hmm.
and I think that's because a lot of times we do make assumptions around who our audiences are and what they need, and we like to be tactics driven as opposed to spending
Hmm.
the time that it really
Hmm.
does take to sit on the customer interviews,
Yeah.
and really extract the information, the information we need to really define pain points in a way that's digestible, and relatable. And so oftentimes what that looks like then is a lot of features on the website, but not a lot of
Hmm.
value. And so
Right.
or a lot of product heavy conversations, and really the problem has nothing to do with sometimes the technology you bring forth. It's actually the right, the problem you help solve. And
Right.
revisiting that, I think, every so often in being involved with these customer conversations, both on the sales and the CS side as much as possible, I think really helps to
Hmm.
walk back the features into the value propositions, as opposed to just saying we're going to try to go and throw
Hmm.
tactics at the wall with our assumptions, because sometimes they're siloed assumptions if you're not close enough to the customer.
Right. And you're so right about targeting too, because I mean, that's literally the most important thing from the beginning. Because if you're not targeting properly, that means that you probably haven't done enough customer research to even create messaging and content that aligns with that target market, one. And then two, if you're targeting the wrong message and the wrong content channels, the whole nine yards, everything below it just starts to crumble immediately.
Mhm.
So, early stage, I think you would agree too, because you've worked with a lot of different early stage companies, and so have I in SaaS. But in early stage, it is pretty difficult to really nail that down. I
Yeah.
mean, the founder probably has some pretty strong, theories and maybe a lot of conversations they've had before they even invest and got investment and all
Mhm.
that, right?
Mhm.
And so that might have been their focus. But a lot of times, it's kind of scrapping together anything they can get done, right?
Mhm.
Closing any deal they can, and just trying to stay alive. So a lot of times, we've noticed if you look at CRM data within an early stage company, sometimes you may be led astray with the data where it may paint a very different story in terms of where the product really is a good fit.
Yeah.
So it's not until those slightly later stages, once you get a little closer to product market fit, where you start to realize, okay, wait a minute, now we're seeing a pattern here. Like, these are our ideal customers. These are the ones that don't churn. These are the ones that lead to the most expansion revenue. These are the ones that are using our product more than any other, segment in our space, et cetera. And then that's when we can say, great, now we can push on the gas with regards to either paid or other distribution channels to get the message and content out. So I think it's just so fundamental to your point on the targeting aspect.
100% for sure. And it's and even as it relates to targeting, it's like it's interesting because we call product marketing, but really
Yeah,
it's like audience marketing, right? Like and
so
when we
true.
like start redefining how we're thinking about that discipline, and really reshaping the way that we think about product marketing, I think it does take a step change into starting to think about, really this function as a role of understanding the audience best. You do have to understand the
Right.
product, but it's really an audience marketing role. um,
Sure. 100%.
and the features are liaisons to enabling solutions.
Yeah. So I'm curious what you think about this, because I think this is always a challenge too. But you mentioned something that I thought was interesting, which is running towards tactics, right? And
Mhm.
just kind of making some assumptions early. And when you come into a new role, and you are in a new role at VP Marketing at Phonexa, you've probably immediately come into a lot of pressure from the CEO. There's pipeline goals to be met. The sales team needs good leads, quality leads, all sorts of things, right? So you've got all that pressure coming in. At the same time, you also know you've got to get the fundamentals right before you really push on the gas. So there's this kind of tug and pull between, hey, come on, we need to do some stuff here. We need to meet some of our short-term goals. Like, we need to be pushing out some type of messaging or content, even if it's not perfect.
Yep.
And I'm curious what like your thought is around that, because it's a very difficult thing to balance, I think, as a VP of marketing, to kind of balance the short-term stuff, but making sure you have the fundamentals before you really push on the gas. But just curious, like what's your thought process and how you navigate that with other marketers?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'm experiencing that just now, right? It's like, how do you and you even experience this to some extent. I don't know if you've experienced this in consulting where,
Yeah.
when you bring a client on board through that onboarding phase, there's discovery, but then there's also these short-term wins and experiments that validate that things are
Yep.
moving along. So you can
Right.
retain that client through the first 3 months when you're building trust, and it's not dissimilar in an in an in-house role, right? Because when you're being brought in many ways you are being brought in as a consultant with fresh eyes to take a look at everything and
Right.
really understand what's working and then what needs work and then where you want to be a year from now. And I think to your
Hmm.
point, balancing those things is a constant battle of prioritization, but also like horizontal alignment across the counterparts that can really help you bring that vision to life. And so,
Hmm.
how I've been really thinking through what this looks like is. Especially when you're inheriting an existing marketing program, I think it's different. In my last two roles, in many ways, it was building it from the bottom up, right? So
Hmm.
it was myself and a few
Right.
others, and we were building the function as opposed to right, inheriting an
Yeah.
existing plan. And I think those two things look really different. So I'll talk about inheriting first, um,
Yeah.
and really how to approach that, considering that's where I'm currently at. I think there's really components that are discovery related, right? Which is like really taking a look at what's currently happening, what's currently on the roadmap. And
Hmm.
what I've tried to do is balance keeping the status quo in terms of the marketing plan while introducing enough quick wins and enough stuff that is seems relatively new to the team that
Hmm.
can essentially get us to the point where while we're getting comfortable reshaping the way that we think about what we're doing, we're also at the same time still executing against the existing marketing plan. It's an exercise, I think, of doing discovery while at the same time keeping the needle moving things in the existing plan that sort of
Hmm.
carry you through the first 3 to 6 months, because you also can't stop doing what you're doing for the sake of discovery and realignment. So it's
Right.
keeping the things that move the needle, assessing that early enough on, and then
Right.
introducing enough of the new strategy sooner that you can kind of pivot. But it is a
Yeah.
balancing act.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. I mean, so you said status quo. I mean, so keeping the status quo. What are some examples of that, though? Because I think people would love to understand what that means. Because I think there's a lot of different things that are going on. Let's say that you might have Google ads going on. You've got some events that are happening. Other things are going on right now. What you're saying is keeping some of those existing channels that are bringing in either leads, opportunities, et cetera, keep those running and don't necessarily pause and stop everything. But at the same time, start to work on some of the fundamental things like, hey, are we positioned correctly
Right.
against the right target audience? Is this the right message? Is this what they really want to hear? And doing customer interviews and all that. Or did you mean something else? Like maybe you could
Yeah,
give
that's
some examples of
exactly what
that.
I mean. It's sort of like, how
Yeah.
do I make the things that are in place better in the short term, right? And then how
Right.
do I capitalize on the discovery I'm doing at the same time, right? And so
Right.
that, when you get to 3 months from now, your Google ads are performing, your trade shows are capturing the leads that might have, if for example, you weren't capturing leads at trade shows efficiently and following up with them,
Right.
those nurture sequences are done more efficiently, right? And so it's
Right.
capturing the low hanging fruit on making those even more impactful while saying, okay, now
Right.
we've done the discovery work to really define how we're going to think about this moving forward.
Right. Exactly. So I want to get your thoughts too, because I actually had the director of demand gen over Mixed Panel on a few weeks back, and Pearl is great. Such a nice woman. I love her. But she had a really, really great graphic that she made
Hmm.
that I thought actually encompassed a little bit of the conversation we're having right now. And I was just curious to get your thoughts on it.
Hmm.
And it's something we actually use internally for a little bit of alignment because it's so important to make sure the theme and what we're ultimately trying to, whatever core message we're trying to get to the audience out across all of the channels that we're operating in. And so she kind of thought about it first as you've got your ICP or segments of ICP.
Mm-hmm.
You've got your theme, which is just a core thing that you want to communicate. It's
Mm-hmm.
just one core statement. And then you might have various messages underneath that theme that are all slightly a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
And then below that, I think she had programs, I would call them just kind of campaigns that contain the content and the messaging that rolls up to each of those individual messages that then roll up to that theme.
Yep.
And then you've got channels below. And
Mm-hmm.
I think like that architecture is really, really important because I know for me, for example, for us, when we're working with SaaS companies, it's so important that we get that type of alignment early on. And if we don't, what a lot of times happens, not just with agencies, but also even in-house teams, is you get a lot of the stuff you were talking about, the tactics and just throwing ads up, doing different stuff, starting an event, doing a webinar, who knows? I don't know. It's not really coordinated with any kind of central thing. We're just doing it because we know it'll drive maybe some leads and maybe some opportunities. We want to see how it goes. So then you get this world where you've got different channels saying different stuff, everyone trying different things. And just wanted to kind of see how you were wrapping your head around that, what you thought about that kind of, process. I mean, it's a pretty typical way to think about it, but similar thought process or different?
Yeah, it's actually the methodology with which we put together refined ICPs. And
Yeah.
I think it's because, it's interesting because there has to be, I think, a strategic narrative that still carries through all of those personas, right? Or all those
Yeah.
respective segments. So it's sort of,
Good
what
point.
is the strategic narrative that even is like sits alongside, like when you think about what's on the at a very basic level, right? What's on the headline of your hero on your homepage? Like, what does that need to evoke that stands true no matter who you're talking to? And how does that
Right.
align with the strategic narrative? But then I think you're totally right in that each segment is distinct in terms of the value and the use cases um, that are unique and roll up to the larger theme or
Right.
single value proposition that you can provide to that audience. So definitely sort of the framework with which we thought about, if we have multiple segments, and in many cases, if those also those segments can be broken up in a lot of different ways, right? We had conversations around, are these um,
Hmm.
industry centric segments in our primary go to market approach, or are they function specific segments?
Right.
And
Exactly.
so those conversations have to be cross functional, right? And in many cases,
Right.
they are business strategy questions, at the end of the
Hmm.
day, right? Because that messaging has to roll up to the larger strategic narrative, and
Yeah.
whether whichever route you go, there's a different path that you take by doing that.
Yeah, totally agree. 100%. I think you nailed it. I mean, I guess the hard part though, I think for everyone is like, where do you start?
Hmm.
And I mean, I'd be curious, like stuff that you're doing right now. So you've got the stuff that's kind of running in the background to keep the lights on, if you will. We'll call that's the keep the lights on program. But what are some things that maybe you're prioritizing, or where would one start? I mean, if another VP of marketing just started a new job and they're like, okay, cool, I need to start getting my house in order. I need to make sure that we have the fundamentals right. What's the best place to start? Or so many things that you're focused on right now that may be interesting to share?
Yeah, so I'll kind of break down the process to coming up with the ICPs in case that's helpful
Yeah.
a new VP of marketing that's coming into an earlier stage startup. But really, it started with, um, firstly, the first sets of things that I did was customer interviews. So I tried to
Hmm.
prioritize doing as many of those as possible. And in my first 2 weeks, I asked the sales team to invite me to as many demos
Hmm.
across customers as possible. And basically,
Love that.
throughout both of those types of conversations, I took pretty diligent notes as it related to what are the themes I'm hearing from the salespeople, and then what are the themes I'm hearing
Mm.
from the prospects. And
Mm.
then, in the customers' interviews themselves, I had, categories of content I was focused on. The first was, what like problems are you facing right now, or what problems were you facing when you were looking for a solution? Like
Mm.
us, what were the challenges in your workflow? And then what were some of the other tools in your tech stack that you needed to make sure your tool of choice was
Mm-hmm.
integrated with? And then also then behavioral questions like, where did you get your information? Where did you
Yep.
you know where do you what communities are you a part of? I think doing those two things created a rough outline of the types of customers and the types of segments, because I asked for a
Yeah.
cross section of different customers. But then we did, following that, we did two sessions with marketing, sales, and CS. And
Mm.
each was focused on a customer discovery workshop where we really broke that down into, now that we have these rough sketches of ICPs, let's go through those same things that I asked in the customer interviews, but let's like
Mm-hmm.
collect the data from sales, CS, and marketing. And so
Right.
we then came up with actual qualitative feedback from our existing team members. And then in stitching those together, we had our first, ICP profiles. And that's
Right.
sort of the definition process we went through. And in the meantime, right, it's important to have stakeholder conversations to make sure that
Right.
that feedback is making it through on the version one of the iteration that you come up with.
Right. I love that you said all that because I think it is so important. It's one of the things we probably don't do enough. And I hope that, I'm sure we'll keep doing it too, because I think there's also the habit of, okay, I'm going to do it really hard as soon as I start. And then a lot of people just kind of
Yeah.
stop and you get bogged down with all sorts of stuff and, stuff happens in life. Right.
Yep.
But, things change, as you mentioned, I think at the beginning of this too, because problems evolve a little bit, situations evolve, there's different competitors that enter the space, the market changes. So there's all these things that we need to keep in mind. So really, that kind of process of constantly getting qualitative feedback, not only from the sales team, customer success, listening to sales calls, gong calls, whatever it may be, is still so important. I think the other things I'd add too, I know when I was talking with Clearbit's head of demand gen, we
Mhm.
talked a lot about their process, which was all about really focused on first starting with the CRM and making sure, and this is kind of coming from Clearbit being a more established company, not, I wouldn't say they're early stage at this point, they've been around for a while. So really going into the CRM and starting to take a look at, all right, what are the makeups or the different segments of people that we've closed over the past 12 to 24 months? And 24 months might sound crazy for some people, but let's say 12 months, right?
Mhm.
12 months of data. Let's take a look at what's coming in. And so that was the first part. And they would just put headers on a firmographic row, understand, okay, cool. Like these are the industries, sizes, kind of the typical stuff that you would do
Yep.
for creating an ICP profile. But then from there, then it goes further. And then, you really start needing to look at subscription based data. So usually that data is held outside of the CRM. You
Yep.
might get with the finance team, or maybe it's held in ChargeBee or whatever the platform is that actually holds that data. And then it's okay, well, what are the cohorts of people or segments of our ICP that are actually expanding the most and
Yep.
spending more money with our product, which are the ones that are using more, like we were talking about earlier. And I think with those two things, you're kind of marrying the qualitative side, which you mentioned, which is so critically important, especially from the messaging positioning side, to, all right, well, what does the data say? I mean,
Yep.
ultimately, like, are these the types of customers? And, clearly you got to be careful the stage of company you do this at, right? Too early, and you can maybe make this, get a little bit
Exactly. Yeah.
too focused, but, too late. And then you've got a message all over the place.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, because I think when you are in those early stages, you can kind of skew the data in some
Yeah.
ways. But I think when you're kind of closer to achieving product market fit, that and beyond, that data is super impactful, because
100%.
I think the expansion revenue is one piece there. Companies that have a higher propensity to be retained over a longer period of
Yeah.
time,
Churn. Yep.
and really customer lifetime value can all be signals for characteristics that help redefine and also add
Hmm.
additional qualities to these ICP profiles, for sure.
Exactly. Exactly. So yeah, totally agreed on your points with ICP. I think the other thing you mentioned too earlier that I maybe want to dig into, maybe we're going a little bit out of order and I'm jumping around. So if you want to
Okay.
go a different direction, please go with me. I'm just kind of winging it here. But the other thing that I think we all talk about is strategic narrative. And I know Andy Raskin seems to get the claim to fame for that. I'm not sure why.
Yeah.
Strategic narratives to me, like that story methodology has been around for forever. But anyway, he's certainly been the one that gets some credit for that with some of the great decks he did. I think it was Uberflip and a handful of others. But is that something that you're focused on right now? Was that already established? Like, where does that fit into the picture? Because maybe say you've got some of the bolts together in terms of who the ICP is. Do you then start looking at okay, what story are we trying to tell? Is that the next step, or what's your thought there?
Yeah, I think strategic narrative is the next step. I think it's hard to do that when it's hard to come up with the shared purpose when really the audience profile even at a broader level is not quite there. And so
Right.
for me, the strategic narrative kind of uh, carries through the brand DNA, and it kind of manifests in a lot of different ways, whether
Mm,
that's internally or publicly. But it's sort of like the difference between we do this and hey, like this is actually the narrative that guides the current
right.
past, current, and future state of why we do what we do. And I think
Right.
and so I think for us it's like that I think we'll formulate the strategic narrative now we have persona profiles that
Hmm.
kind of carry through across the organization. It's really thinking through what is the DNA that carries through, and what is the narrative that carries through. And when earlier when I was talking
Mm,
about sort of the example of like what sits on the hero of your website, and how does that apply to all the various segments. I really think of that as
mm,
the manifestation of the strategic narrative, right? It's
yeah.
almost one form in which that narrative takes shape in a single place on the website, but that carries through across everything, right? Sales,
Mm,
CS, product marketing. And so as specific as you get in your messaging, it that narrative should remain true even then, and so it
right.
takes various ways, shapes, and forms. I kind of think of it as the soul of the company, in many.
Oh my gosh, so true. So true. And I mean again, you said it. I mean again, everything, the website is a channel, right? It's where people can find you. They can look at what your copy says, what your messaging, how it works, get to know you. The same thing with channels. There's people that are clicking on ads or clicking on content organically, whatever it may be. So again, all that stuff needs to roll up to something that's core. And for me, I think always the biggest thing, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I think the thing that lacks the most a lot of times with these things, and this is so core to the strategic narrative, is understanding like where people are today
Mhm.
and helping them understand where they're going to go with you,
Yes.
and getting that link there. A lot of people, it's just kind of you jump and you say, here's where we're going to take you, but you haven't really aligned with where they are today. And a lot of that's like, what's the current situation? How do they do things today? What's the problem and all that,
Yeah. Yeah,
you know?
and I think too, it's for B2B companies, it's almost a little bit more, it's challenging, right? Because um in many cases you're like, I just need the software that does X and that helps me do X, right? Once you become problem
Right.
aware, at least. And
Sure.
and I
Sure.
think the strategic narrative almost take steps, forward from there, right? Where like
Hmm.
for us it's like, sure, we sell B2B software, but how do we actually help the consumer who is now sitting inside of the operation suite that this other company is using? How do we get that customer what they need, right? Like, how do you
Yeah.
personalize the narrative of the actual user on the other end of the B2B software that you're selling, or in many cases, and it's not really even sometimes the ICP, right? It's like the ICP is buying a platform to actually
Hmm.
do something that's a pain point for them, but that something is tied to a very human narrative that even might exist beyond them. And for us, that's, the customer on the other end who's trying to be matched with another consumer services business, right? But we're
100%.
not telling that
Yeah.
story necessarily. When you're B2B software, you're talking about what you do in many cases and how you impact the ICP, but there's layers there that are sometimes even not
Right.
related to the person who makes the decision to buy, and you need to like surface that.
Ooh, that's a good one. If I think I heard you correctly, it's something I know I say a lot, which is, there's the people that actually are feeling the problem today,
Yeah.
and they may not be the CEO. The CEO may be the one to sign the check, and may be the one that delegated down a decision to someone below them to figure that problem out. But it may not be them that really feels that problem per se in the organization. So it's the one. It's kind of the whole selling to the top of the suite and then selling to the end user.
Yep.
And it's that whole motion there about making sure that you can have two completely different messages there that make sense to both people versus just saying the same thing to both at the same time.
Yep.
And I think very few B2B SaaS companies, at least the more early stage Series A to Series C, have that mapped out well enough to have really strong messaging to that. At least that's what we see working across a whole bunch of them, because it is tough to have that. And also the budget, of course, to make sure you're messaging differently. You've got different content. Most teams are struggling to even keep up with the content they have today. So to do it with all these different personas, oh yeah, we need this message and this content for the CFO and this one for the CEO, and it just gets crazy, And it's like, I just want to get out a couple of pieces that are good.
Yeah.
And I want people to enjoy this stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
So
yeah.
So I guess we're almost wrapping up. I want to make sure we hit on one thing though before we jump. And so, because I think there's still so much more to talk about, but we can't go all day long here, unfortunately. But in terms of like, as we kind of back away from the strategic narrative, I think the one thing I think is a lot of times a struggle is there's all these different types of messages and things like that we could communicate to the market. At least that's certainly what we see. It's like, hey, well, we do this, we do that, and we could help them with this. And I know they have this problem, et cetera. And I'm curious, like right now at Phonexa, if you're juggling that right now at the same time as, as we speak, where you're trying to figure out, okay, well, there's this whole entire big list in a spreadsheet of potential problems and things that you've been hearing through all the customer interviews you've been doing. Which one do we focus on?
Yeah.
Which one do we start with? And does this just come back to like experimentation, or does it roll up to something where you're saying, you know what, we've made a decision. I've heard this 1,000 times. These seem to be the top three. Boom. These are the ones we're going to focus on. And we're going to make sure that we've got content and messaging cross channels to make sure we communicate that message so it stays consistent. Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there is a process of narrowing down. I think in terms of key messages, there's probably 15 or 20 that were drafted, and I think it's like right. Yeah. I think it is an exercise in leadership aligning leadership to aligning around the messages that manifest the broader vision of the company, and being able to focus on those first. But I think there is a process of experimentation, right? I think the spirit of those statements has to remain true and be, like we talked about, aligned with the larger strategic narrative. But I think there's still an element that's, as you move forward, there are versions of that you'll test, and there are versions of that that might just naturally perform better than others. And so I think you have to ground yourself in the priority messages, and I believe that those things manifest the vision of your company and what you really do to help the buyers and customers who are coming through the door. And those messages should be clear. And then there's also sort of versions of that I think can be tested over a period of time. But I think there are some commitments you need to make. Yeah.
And I think that's the point. Over a period of time, I think that so often it's just like throwing up tons of different stuff all at the same time. Yeah. And then it becomes very hard to figure out what worked and what didn't.
Yeah.
And especially in B2B, where typically you're not talking about really low ACV product. You're talking about a longer buying journey, multiple touch points. So to kind of say, yep, we did it for 2 weeks and it doesn't seem like anyone's engaged that message. It's like, well, did we really go with that core theme long enough for anyone to get it? I don't think so. They maybe saw that ad, if it's ads, right? A handful of times. I think, yeah, sure, we got some initial leading indicators, but I think there's some more work to do, and we need to stay a little more locked in on the core goal there. So
yeah, for sure.
Well, I love it. Well, I guess if anyone's listening, you are still looking for a product marketing manager. So anyone that is looking for a job, keep your eyes out for her and Phonexa. And so any closing words, anything that we missed that you want to mention before we jump off here, or do we nail it?
This was awesome. We can keep talking for hours.
I'm sure.
Thanks so much for having me, and really, really appreciate the time.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thanks.
All right, see you.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to another episode of the Demand Podcast. Again, I'm Jonathan Bland, the co-founder of Omni Lab. I'll also have with me Jason Steele, who's the other co-founder of Omni Lab on this podcast as well. We're a demand gen agency for seed to Series B SaaS startups. If you like this episode, or you're looking for some help with demand gen, please feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn over a DM, or you can go just directly to our website. That's omnilabconsulting.com. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you on the next episode, where we'll be talking about all things demand gen. Until then, thanks. Bye-bye.